Four, three, two, one. Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. And as last week, I'm with my very good friend, Michael Sullivan. Mike, you live in Carolina, correct?
I did, but now I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is only
Ah,
about a couple hours difference from where I used to live.
okay, very, very good. Been to Knoxville one time in 1982. My wife and I drove a 1969 Mach 1 428 Cobra Jet from,
Ooh.
yeah, from Ardmore, excuse me, from Shawnee, Oklahoma, all the way to Knoxville. They uh, had the Mustang Grand Nationals
Wow.
there at Knoxville. There were hundreds upon hundreds of Mustangs there. It was an absolutely fantastic time. We had our infant daughter with us. She didn't enjoy the trip very much, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, they rarely do.
Yeah, very, very rarely do. But it really was a fantastic trip. We stayed with some folks there from one of the local churches that happened to be car enthusiasts and opened their home to us. So we had just a fantastic time.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, folks, we're going to continue our discussion this evening, our response to Doug Wilson, who recently produced a video giving 10 reasons. Now, the name of the video was Theological Jenga and Full Preterism. He produced that in March of this year. He has since produced another video, which we're not giving all that much attention to. He didn't add any new information in that video. At least I don't remember it. Do you, Mike? Did
Talking
he?
about the Hymenaeus and Philetus.
Yeah, and we will address that subject for sure. We absolutely have to take care of that subject. But Mike, I don't know if you've noticed or not, but on my channel, and I'm going to be using these videos for my regular Thursday morning videos, my morning musings, in addition to posting it earlier as well. But I don't know if you had been on my YouTube channel or not, but about 15 minutes before coming on air, I looked and our very first video had over 920 views.
Oh, nice.
So there's obviously interest in from people who want to know, okay, how do preterists respond to this very noted, quote, scholar, unquote, by the name of Doug Wilson. So I was very encouraged by that. And the comments underneath our video from last week have been very, very positive, very appreciative of what you and I are doing.
Yeah.
So I think we're on the right track here, Mike, providing a service for people to have some, not, I don't want to use the word ammunition necessarily, although that's not a bad term, but at least a resource that they can go to. They know what Doug Wilson is saying. Now they need the counterpoint. And so that's,
Well,
yeah,
and this gets back to an overarching issue, and that is obviously there's not just 14 of us out there. There is a if it has garnered 1,000 or so views in this short a period of time,
yeah,
it tells everybody, including Doug Wilson, that this is an issue that he needs to debate. And I challenged him to a debate, just a one-on-one debate, hoping to set it up at Westminster Theological Seminary.
mhm,
And he tentatively agreed, but he said he had some family issues with either his father or father-in-law wasn't feeling well. He would get back to me. I got back with him in about, I don't know, 4 6 months just to touch base. And then he decided, oh, I'm just too busy. I won't be able to do it. And that's one of the things that we will eventually address. But just to your point, that if so many people are interested in it, Doug, why not debate either Don one-on-one, me one-on-one, or we've agreed to do a partner debate.
mhm.
Doug can get someone he wants, and we can have a partner debate. That's what people want to see,
That's right.
honestly. And Doug running scared and running away and making up all these excuses is not doing him any good. And it's not helping Gary DeMar, because Gary DeMar's like, we need to study these things. You need to answer some of these questions. And you're not,
Right.
like we covered in our last video, totally disregarded Daniel 12, just out of hand. So
Well, I think those are excellent points, and a lot of people agree with that. Absolutely, totally agree with that. You know, in reference to his comment, all 14 preterists out there,
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded some years ago that I had challenged uh, a man very, very prominent in the Church of Christ named Alan Hires. He has been a judge. I think he's retired now, but he at the time he's a very, very prominent judge in Memphis, Tennessee. Very, very highly sought after lecture speaker, known as a debater. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I challenged him to a debate. He wrote back and really exhibited a horrible attitude of arrogance
Uh,
and said, why would I want to waste my time debating a subject that literally no one is
uh,
interested in? The subject of eschatology has no interest for anyone these days. And here's the irony of it. He had taken the time to write some rather lengthy articles
right.
against covenant eschatology.
Yeah.
And so to follow up on that irony is the fact that it was either the week before he wrote that or the week after he responded to me. Uh, I had a radio debate on John Anderson's program, and a Professor Ingelsma from Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, very, very noted Reformed amillennialist. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
He and I had a debate on John Anderson's radio program.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Keep going.
According to John Anderson's, uh, I don't know exactly how they do that, but they had portals open and they had calculators on those portals. Every single portal was completely packed. People were jamming the portals because there were so many people still trying to get on. There wasn't enough room on. There was a minimum of 250,000 people heard that debate.
Good grief.
And so when Alan Hires wrote and said nobody's interested in debate or eschatology, and certainly not this subject, I wrote back and I said, well, it's interesting that you say that, Brother Hires, because just last week I had a debate, and according to the portal calculators, a minimum of 250,000 people were listening. Not only were they listening, but more people were trying to log on but couldn't because the lines were jammed.
And specific to Doug Wilson, Doug, if there's only 14 of us out there, why did you co-author this book published by PNR Publishing? Why would the PNR Publishing think it was important to publish this book if there's not a growing challenge from the full preterist community? And of course, we responded to you, and you have not responded back. Not one article.
Right.
Not one article out of these 7 men. And Matheson promised me he was going to respond to my chapter in an article. Never has. Not one article. And Gary North always used to say when they were debating and responding to the amillennialists and the dispensationalists, whether it was defending postmillennialism or theonomy, he would always say this: the side that stops responding has lost the debate.
I've heard him say it.
These guys haven't even responded in how many years now? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, I agree. And you mentioned me debating, Doug. I have challenged him no less than 4 times, and not a word, literally not one word. And then he goes off into this little discussion of all 14 of us preterists, knowing full well.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, you and I both know that Doug was not only being sarcastic, but he knows he's misrepresenting the facts.
He's being dishonest. Absolutely.
He really is. Okay. I wanted to go back, Mike, and to touch on a subject that Doug brought up in his 10 points and that we covered last week. And I've had any number of people contact me personally wanting us to discuss this further. And that is Doug's argument. Well, the Pharisees believed in physical resurrection. Paul said he was a Pharisee. Therefore, Paul believed in physical resurrection. Now, we
Mm.
covered the fact there was no one monolithic view of resurrection in Israel. I think we covered that sufficiently.
Correct.
One of the things that I covered that a lot of people wanted us to develop even more is the fact that from Acts chapter 23, when Paul's standing before the Sanhedrin and he said, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee of the Pharisees." And immediately there was a division within the Sanhedrin because the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection, life after death, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously the Pharisees did believe in those things. Josephus shares that with us. And so the Pharisees declared that Paul was a great guy, not worthy of any kind of punishment. He gets to go, but he's on trial. There is approximately 14 days between Acts 23, when Paul's in front of the Sanhedrin, until Acts 24, verse 13 and following, where Paul says, "After the way which these men call a sect, so worship I the God of my fathers." And he said, "This I confess to you, that after the way which they call a sect, so worship I the God of my fathers, that there is about to be resurrection." So Paul calls attention to the fact Pharisees believed in resurrection. He believes in resurrection, but here's the kicker to the whole thing. They want to kill Paul for his view of the resurrection.
Yes.
So that raises, as we touched on last week and developed just a small bit, what happened with the Pharisees between Acts 23, what a mighty fine guy Paul is because he believes in the resurrection, and Acts 24, where Paul says, "For the hope of the promise of the resurrection, am I on trial?" A doctrine to which these men agree, but they want to kill me. What changed in the Pharisaic attitude? And it's nothing changed with Paul. He's still teaching resurrection in Acts 24, just like he did in Acts chapter 23. What changed with the Pharisees in their understanding of Paul, so that from declaring him totally innocent of all charges, and a fine fella he was, to now wanting to kill him for his doctrine of the resurrection?
Well, do you want to keep going?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think we kind of covered it.
We did some.
We did talk about that there were spiritual views, all right, of possibly even some of the Pharisees and some of the Jews at that time. And I don't see anything in the literature where they were going out and killing them because they believed in a spiritual.
No.
So I think and I'd have to read Acts again, just to be specific, but I think what's taking place there is that it's a spiritual resurrection, which I think that they wouldn't have that much of a problem with. I think the problem is that this spiritual resurrection is connected to Jesus's resurrection. He is the foundation of Israel's hope, of the 12 tribes, right? That's what he says. The 12 tribes of Israel is where this hope of resurrection is. And he's teaching and he's preaching that. But when he says that it's connected to Christ, on top of it being a spiritual resurrection, I think the combination of those two things just really gets them just gnashing their teeth. That's my.
No, yeah, I agree with that in principle. I think there's also something else at work here. And I suggested everyone get a copy of my book, Paul on Trial, Paul, the Pharisees and the Resurrection. Here's the reason why. I see a direct parallel. Matter of fact, let me see if I can find find the chart.
Yes. Yeah, I actually use that chart in my new book.
Okay. Yes, on page 75 of this book, here are some parallels between Jesus's ministry and message and Paul's message and ministry. Jesus taught and offered the kingdom. Paul taught and offered the kingdom. No problem there, seemingly. Jesus was initially accepted by the Jews. The Pharisees initially thought Paul taught the resurrection like they did. Number three, here's where it gets really, really critical. Jesus rejected the offer of the kingship from the Jews. John chapter 6 and verse 15. When Jesus perceived that they were about to come and to make him king, he withdrew himself. Likewise, the Pharisees came to reject Paul's doctrine of the resurrection. Number four, timing here is critical. When Jesus rejected the Jewish offer, they put Jesus on trial for being seditious, claiming to be king. His kingship was not the kind of kingship that they wanted, as Pilate himself affirmed. Then, when we come to Paul, when the Pharisees came to understand Paul's resurrection doctrine, they put him on trial with the false charge of sedition. Same identical charge that they leveled against Jesus. Just like Pilate found Jesus innocent, the Romans found Paul innocent of political sedition. The real issue was resurrection, just like Paul said all along.
Mm-hmm.
Paul said, these men did not find me in the temple causing trouble, violating any of our customs. That's absolutely false. The issue is resurrection, Paul said. Jesus's kingdom, the one that he offered, was a subversion of the false Jewish hope of the day.
That's right.
Paul's doctrine of the resurrection was a subversion of the false Jewish hope of the day. Now, to drive this home, when we understand that there is a one-to-one temporal connection between kingdom and resurrection, Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead at his appearing and kingdom. Judgment of the living and dead, kingdom, parousia. No separation.
Exactly.
And so it seems to me like what we have in Acts chapter 23 and 24 is just a classic reworking or retelling in parallel form of the ministry of Jesus.
Yes.
That to me is the real key of why the Pharisees rejected Paul. I don't doubt for a moment that what you said is true, because they categorically rejected Jesus through the resurrection and because of his resurrection. No question. So when they understood that Paul was teaching resurrection through Christ and he was rejecting their concept of the kingdom, you know, when Paul said that God had translated them out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light, that's not the kind of kingdom the Jews had in mind at all. Now, what's interesting about that to me, Mike, is that the Jews called the world outside of Judaism darkness. They called the kingdom of Israel light.
Mm-hmm.
Why should they object? Well, because now Paul, obviously Jesus and the rest of the New Testament writers, are appropriating the kingdom and saying, you know what? The real kingdom of light is in Jesus Christ, because he said, I'm the light of the world. And so they saw...
they're the ones that are out in the darkness.
They are the ones in darkness.
Like the Gentiles. They're the ones that are cast out.
Exactly.
Needing to get in, and they didn't like that. And although there were spiritual views of the resurrection, no one was putting, and the kingdom maybe, no one was putting it together the way Jesus and Paul was. That was such a threat to the Pharisees and to their understanding of redemption and everything else. And I think that's where the hostility comes in towards Jesus and Paul, because they're connecting it all together, on top of Jesus saying, I'm God, and unless you believe in me, you too will die in your sins.
Yes.
So
yeah, great points. I agree 100%. Okay, well, let's move on then. Associated with that point that he had was that he believed in the eschatology of Martha. We covered that. We talked about the Jewish concept, which he seems to think is so monolithic, which is just patently false historically.
Right.
And then he mentioned, I think it was his point number 3, if you have it listed as well, that he believes that we have to honor the resurrection doctrine found in Second Maccabees.
Yeah, no, yeah, I've got that too. Actually, that's point 2, but
Okay.
yeah, Second Maccabees, I think 7:23. I'm not familiar in some of the Old Testament literature I was reading on the Jewish views of the resurrection. I think that one wasn't like, well, I'd have to go back. I don't remember that being a physical one. It's just a resurrection text per se, isn't it? Kind of
Yeah.
open
In
interpretation.
in the works called the 12 Testaments of the Patriarchs, I believe that's the name of it, you do find some references to physical bodies coming out of the grave. No question about that. Boy, it's been a while since I read through the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs.
But this particular text in Maccabees, I'm not so sure. I should have prepared for that one, but I will look that up
Okay.
and we will get very specific with that text and what the Jews thought of it.
Oh, well,
Um,
I printed
but they were mixed all over the place. They would look at references like this and say it's spirit, or in First Enoch, some of them would interpret it as spiritual, some of them would interpret it as physical. So appealing to Second Maccabees, I don't think really gets Wilson out of the actual dilemma, but
Oh, it doesn't at all, because in some of those apocryphal letters, I think it's even Enoch, if I'm not mistaken, there is an emphatic rejection of a physical resurrection
absolutely.
and of being in heaven in glorified bodies. No physical body, no raising of the physical body out of the grave, not there. It's not mentioned. It's simply excluded, but having a body in heaven glorified and marvelous and eternal. And so that's a categoric rejection of Doug Wilson. So he wants to appeal to the Maccabees, and yet you have others. And let's face it, the book of Enoch was incredibly influential and popular in the first century, in the first century church even. That's just a well-known fact. And so once again, we find Doug Wilson ever so conveniently appealing to a given intertestamental work in support of his position, when the fact is, I thought we'd just take a look at this narrative that is found in Maccabees.
Okay, yeah.
Because here what we find Eleazar, pardon me, having 7 brothers and the mother of those brothers. And this is in chapter 6 and 7. And interestingly enough, I found this reading on Bart Ehrman's site.
Really?
Yeah.
He's another guy we've challenged to debate, but he won't do that.
Yeah, I know. So what's interesting, and we're going to see what develops out of it. You know, after my debate last week with Mark Smith, Derek Lambert, who sponsors Myth Vision, he wrote to me. It was very, very complimentary of the job that I did. And he said, "Are you okay with me being on the lookout with others who are willing to debate you?" And I was like, ho, 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 you betcha. Let's see what happens here. So we'll see what comes of that. And by the way, I've just got to tell you the feedback. I'm getting phone calls, I'm getting private emails, I'm getting tons and tons. They've slacked off today, but I mean, just tons and tons of positive feedback from that. I mentioned last week that I had even been contacted by one man who was on the fence between atheism and maintaining his faith. And he said, "To be honest with you, I'm rooting for you in this debate." I haven't heard from him, so I don't know where he's at. But if what everybody else is saying about the debate had any impact on him, if he felt the same way, then we can only thank the good Lord for the power of his word. to rescue that man from atheism. So here we have in the book of Maccabees, Second Maccabees, we have the account of the martyrdom of these brothers during this intertestamental period of time. Antiochus himself, Antiochus Epiphanes was there himself. And they took one brother and they used whips and thongs to force these brothers to eat pork. They refused, and one of them bravely told Antiochus that he would rather die than, quote, transgress the laws of our ancestors. This enraged Antiochus so much that he ordered the executioner to take the young man, to scalp him, cut out his tongue, cut off his hands and feet, while his brothers and mother look on. When he was then utterly helpless, but still breathing, strangely enough, the king ordered him roasted on a giant metal pan placed atop a large fire, and thus he died. Now, each of the brothers saw what would happen. This is Ehrman's reporting of this now. If they continued to refuse, but they remained stalwart. One by one, they were tortured to death, while the surviving brothers and their mother encouraged them to stay true to the law. You know, it's difficult to imagine being there and witnessing that. That's just staggering to even think about that. But anyway, Ehrman himself says this is a powerful and moving narrative. But he says, for my purposes here, what is especially interesting are the words spoken by the brothers before their deaths. The second brother is tortured like the first, but while he can still speak, he tells the king, you accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life because we have died for his laws. Now, a note
There's nothing
here.
there about physical body.
That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
He does not say we're going to come out of the dirt.
Right.
Okay, well, we'll go on. The third brother says before his death, with respect to his tongue and his hands that were about to be cut off. Now, notice what he says. This is fascinating. I got these from heaven, and because of his laws, I disdained them. It doesn't look to me like he has an overreaching attraction or attachment to his physical body. But he said, because of his laws, I disdain them, and from him, I hope to get them back again. Yeah, okay. Restoration of a physical body. What else does he say? Nothing. And we want to come back to this third brother because it raises all sorts of interesting questions. Okay. When the fourth brother, he dies, here's where it gets really, really interesting for people like Doug Wilson, Kenneth Gentry. We even touched on this a little bit last week, but here we have support from this fourth brother. When the fourth brother dies, he exclaims to the king, one cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals and to cherish the hope of God, to cherish the hope God gives us of being raised again by him. Okay, raised again. But watch this. But for you, speaking to Antiochus and his torturers, for you there will be no resurrection to life. No resurrection.
So he's teaching annihilation for the wicked.
Obviously.
Yes.
And so those faithful to God will be raised, Ehrman says, but not those who deny God and oppose his people. Now, there's actually a lot here that really does not give aid and comfort to Doug Wilson. Notice that this emphatic statement that the wicked will not be raised to life. They won't be alive.
Right. There goes Doug's view.
There goes Doug's view of an eternal conscious torment.
So how much of a parallel does he want to have here is what you're saying?
That's the whole point. You
Yeah.
know, if you're going to say, oh, I believe in the eschatology and the resurrection of second Maccabees. Well, wait a minute, Doug. The second Maccabees said the wicked do not rise. And by the way, we have a very interesting verse on this from Isaiah chapter 26. When Yahweh is addressing through the prophet his people, and he says, your dead bodies will rise, but their bodies, that's the bodies of the wicked, will not rise. Now, wait. Doug doesn't believe this. Doug believes that there is a resurrection of the just and the unjust. But Isaiah 26 says, the wicked will not rise. Now, that's a real conundrum.
Yeah.
That's problematic. Then,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to read something real quick out of my book, and I'm quoting Lester Grabe in his book, An Introduction to Second Temple Judaism, History and Religion of the Jews in the Times of Nehemiah, the Maccabees, Hillel, and Jesus. He says this: it is sometimes asserted that the resurrection of the body was the characteristic Jewish belief. Now, that's what Doug is saying. This is not borne out by the data. A variety of beliefs seem to be attested about the same time in Israelite history. One of these was the resurrection of the body, but there is little reason to think that it was earlier or more characteristic of Jewish thinking than the immortality of the soul or the resurrection of the spirit. And it is clear that some Jews still maintain the older belief in no afterlife. The Sadducees see such and such, or one group who thought so. So did Ben Sarar. Well, anyway, the point is that, and he goes through he goes through all of this stuff, Jubilees, Enoch. I mean, this guy, there's no stone that's not uncovered with this guy. And, that's pretty clear.
Send me a link to that book, the title of that book and the author.
Yeah, I will. And
I don't.
That article's actually online. I'll get that for you.
Yeah, do that for me. Well, I mean, this goes back to what we touched upon last week repeatedly, and that is, he states emphatically, Karagunis in the article that I cited last week, PDF article, when people like Doug Collins say, well, the Jews believed, and they try to make it out like that there's a singular monolithic type and myopic almost view of resurrection among the ancient Jews, they're simply not being honest with the data that is out there. And there is a wealth of information that is out there.
And as we've pointed out, it's not just a spiritual resurrection, but they were teaching that 40 years after the Messiah would be cut off, there was going to be this resurrection.
That's exactly right.
This is New Testament eschatology.
Yeah. The book of Enoch teaches emphatically that the 70th generation from Enoch
would see the consummation.
I've got to tell a little anecdote here. In one of my early debates with a guy named Bill Lockwood, held in Marlow, Oklahoma, I kept asking him, please give me, since Paul said that his doctrine of the resurrection was from the Old Testament, give me the Old Testament prophecy that foretold the end of time and physical resurrection. Well, during the first debate, he absolutely refused to do that. In the second debate, I kept pressing him. I said, I have asked for Bill to give us the Old Testament prophecy of the end of time and the resurrection over and over. And I said he refuses to do it. So, Bill, give us the text. He gave the book of Enoch. So I got up and I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is absolutely stunning. I said, we've got a man here who doesn't believe that Enoch belongs in the Bible at all. He doesn't believe it's inspired. I specifically asked for an Old Testament book, Old Testament prophecy of the resurrection and the end of time, and he gives us Enoch. And I said, Bill, I guess you didn't read Enoch very well. I said, here's right. I had a chart with the quote from Enoch that the judgment, the end, was to be in the first century.
Mm-hmm.
Well, needless to say, he didn't raise the issue of Enoch again. I mean, it was incredible. Now then, the third brother back here in Second Maccabees, uh, as he is being tortured and parts of his body were being removed by him or from him, the third brother says, let me find this again. I got these from heaven, and because of his laws, I disdained them. And from him, I hope to get them back again. So the resurrection is a time, according to this brother, in which hands and feet that have been dismembered, cut off, tongues that have been cut off, perhaps ears that have been cut off, are going to be restored. Now, that raises a question. Jesus, after his resurrection, still had the wounds in his side, still had the wounds in his hands and in his feet. That doesn't seem to comport very well with this view of Second Maccabees, who said, I'm going to get my body restored.
Right.
So once again, we are forced to ask the question, seems to me, which view of these brothers, no resurrection for the wicked, physical resurrection of a body, another brother not even mentioning resurrection. And, I think it would probably be safe to assume, although it's not said, I think it'd probably be safe to assume that the first brother, held the same view as his other brothers. Okay, resurrection to life. But he doesn't say coming out of the ground. Even the brother that talks about the restoration of his body doesn't talk about coming out of the ground. They talk about being raised. Well, that concept of being raised, Stephanos Mahalios, I had forgotten his first name last week, in the eschatological Danielic hour in the book of Gospel of John, Mahalios points out that this whole concept of resurrection and restoration did not always entail the restoration of a physical body. And oh, by the way, something else I failed to point out from Mahalios last week is Mahalios, and you called attention to it from the old Greek, is that it's literally the hour, the last hour would be the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12. And anyway, Mahalios is just emphatic in all of his appeals to the Daniel chapter 12 that Mahalios sees John in the Gospel of John just echoing over and over and over again. He's very emphatic. He's very clear. Jesus sees that hour of the resurrection having come 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
And so I wonder if Doug would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, not only the Old Greek Septuagint hour of the end of Daniel 12, but as you've pointed out to me, Wycliffe in his translation points out another Septuagint version, which uses kairos, right?
Yes.
Which is the appointed time.
Appointed time.
Don, how many appointed times of resurrection and judgment of the dead are mentioned in the New Testament? Are there two or just one?
Let me see. One. And listen,
And they were eagerly expecting that.
Exactly.
And there were all kinds of time text connected to that one appointed time, Doug Wilson. But you have two eschatons, one for Israel in AD 70 and one at the end of world history. And Paul only knows of one. One hope, one appointed time.
On my Now TV program, which airs every Friday morning at 9:30, and I post it on YouTube as well, I've been doing a series on kairos, the appointed time. The more I have studied that word and its use prophetically in the Old Testament and how it is used in the New Testament to speak of the then present time. Peter says in what is it is an absolutely incredible text. I have used First Peter chapter 4 in discussions with Sam Frost, in discussion with Jeff Cunningham, in discussions with other skeptics who deny the truth of covenant eschatology. Here's what happens. First Peter chapter 4 and verse 5. Christ was ready. From the Greek word hetoimos, meaning not only morally prepared, but temporally ready. Alfred's Greek Testament says that the Greek reader of that verse would think of the imminent judge, not just simply morally prepared, the imminent judge. So Christ was ready, temporally ready, to judge the living and the dead. Okay, test time, Mike. Is the time of the judgment of the living and the dead the time of the resurrection?
Absolutely. How can you have the judgment of the dead without the resurrection of the dead? And we go, I mean, you can even go to, I'm not going to sidetrack you, but just side note, Revelation 11. Doug, you say that was fulfilled in AD 70. We're
That's right.
asking you, how do you have the judgment of the living and the dead without having the resurrection of the dead? We want to know, where is your resurrection in AD 70? Gentry has committed, Jordan has committed, DeMar has committed.
Matheson has committed.
Okay, Matheson has committed. So where
Now,
are
he
you?
equivocated, but he actually did posit Revelation chapter 11 as AD 70.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but I'm talking about like these guys have admitted that there was a spiritual resurrection, whether it was corporately or Jordan saying that souls were raised out of Hades into God's presence. And we have two of everything from Doug Wilson, except for a resurrection in AD 70. So I'm wondering, when is he going to catch up to speed to finally admit with these other partial preterists, yeah, there was a spiritual resurrection.
And this is an extremely, extremely powerful point that these men have been avoiding like the plague. I mean, let's just face it. So back to First Peter chapter 4, but that's all great stuff, and we needed to get that in there. Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. Well, the living and the dead are mentioned in Revelation chapter 11 that we've just seen. All of these men, Gentry, Jordan, etc., all posit resurrection AD 70. Judgment of the living and the dead in AD 70. Folks, don't fail to catch that. That's critical. Okay. First Peter chapter 4, verse 7. The end of all things has come. It's in the perfect tense, meaning it's arrived. They're living in the time of the end. And so you have Christ was ready, temporally ready to judge the living and the dead, resurrection. You have the end of all things, which I think Doug Wilson is going to agree the resurrection is at the end of all things. So here's Peter affirming the end of all things has drawn near or has come. And then in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, the time has come for the judgment. Now, as I've written extensively on this in my different books, it is literally the kairos, definite article, tone chiron. So it is the
appointed judgment.
It is the appointed time for the judgment. It is tone.
Daniel.
Pardon?
That's Daniel 12 then.
That's Daniel chapter 12. That's the last hour. That is the hour of the resurrection.
Wait a second. Doug told us how vague Daniel 12 was. And we had to let the New Testament interpret Daniel 12. And you've just connected a time statement that he connects to AD 70 with the judgment and resurrection of Daniel 12. Where is he?
Great point. Great point. So here is Peter, and I want to back up just a little bit and take note of something. In Luke chapter 21 and verse 8, Jesus said, beware and do not be deceived. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the end has come, or the time has come. The chiron, the kairos. The end has come. Do not go after them. So here's Jesus condemning premature declarations of the end. Peter was sitting there listening to him condemn premature declarations of the end, the telos. So Peter, who was sitting there hearing the condemnation of premature declarations of the end, later in that very generation said, Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. The end of all things, the telos, had arrived. And remember, Jesus said, don't believe anybody who says the end has come before the time has come. Just don't believe them. Don't go after them. And that means don't teach it prematurely either. And then Peter says, the kairos has arrived.
Don, but Paul in Romans 8 and Romans 13, 11, and 12, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, 29, he says the appointed time has grown very short. So they're tracking on Daniel. Paul is tracking on Daniel. Jesus is tracking on Daniel, the end of the age, the appointed time. And they're saying, and like you said, Jesus says, don't say the appointed time is near and shortly, quickly at hand until these signs are fulfilled. The signs are fulfilled, Paul's saying it. And that's all goes back to Daniel 12. And that is why he just avoided Daniel 12.
And there's something that we need to point out. Not only is he going back to Daniel chapter 12, but one of the ways that we know it is that there's no other Old Testament book, bar none, no other Old Testament book uses the word kairos in the Septuagint more than Daniel. Daniel speaks of the appointed time either explicitly, Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, Daniel chapter 12, verse 9 and following, or implicitly when he goes, the vision of the fourth beast, Daniel chapter 2. Well, that's the appointed time. I mean, the word kairos is not used there, but it's 4 kingdoms. And what time frame are we in when John comes saying the kingdom of heaven is drawn near? Oh, well, we're in the days of the Roman Empire. Same thing with Daniel chapter 7. 4 beasts that would arise. 4th beast, Roman Empire. The appointed time of the end. In that 4th empire, the little horn would arise, persecute the saints, wear them down. The Ancient of Days would come, or as the Septuagint says,
he would come as the Ancient of
Days.
He
would come as the Ancient of Days. I knew you'd jump right in there. He would come as the Ancient of Days, destroy the little horn, and what would happen? The kingdom
would inherit the kingdom.
The saints would inherit the kingdom. Folks, this is the consistent eschatology of the Bible. This is not a twofold eschatology of AD 70 and end of time. Or a tripartite. Who knows? I mean, these guys may invent a tripartite type of eschatology. I mean, after all, we got 2,000 years and counting, and nothing is happening. So
what he says of Maccabees is kind of irrelevant, but he does tie it into Hebrews 11 and the better resurrection. And I think you want to go there, or do you want?
Yes.
Okay. So we've established Second Temple Judaism. You can pull out things that say physical resurrection. You can pull out things that say spiritual resurrection. Doug is playing games with the Orthodox view of Second Temple. He's just playing games. All right. So going to Hebrews 11, Don, in the book of Hebrews, when he mentions better things, true things, are these spiritual or are they physical?
Yeah, I mean, they are invariably spiritual. I mean, Christ is head over a better house than that of Moses. I don't think we're talking about a literal physical house. It's the spiritual house. Christ is priest over the true tabernacle, which God pitched, and not man. He is the high priest, not of the tribe of Levi, but of the tribe of Melchizedek. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Where is his priesthood? It's in the heavens. If he were on earth, he could not be a priest, seeing that they're priests according to the law. I mean, every single better thing, better covenant, better sacrifices, etc., in the book of Hebrews is spiritual. It is not physical.
Next question. You had touched on this before. The Jew inseparably connected inheritance of the land with the resurrection. Hebrews 13, verse 14. When would the city come? When would and obviously there's land underneath the city, I would think.
I would think, yeah. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14, we have here no abiding, from the Greek word meno, remaining, permanent. We have here no abiding city, but we seek one that is about to come. And Kenneth Gentry understood that until he saw the train coming and realized what that was going to mean for his eschatology, because he wrote in his initial work on the beast of Revelation that mellow with the infinitive indicates imminence. Well, guess what? He's right on that. The Blast of Brunner, Greek English grammar of the New Testament and other literature, says emphatically, item number 356, I forgot the page number, but it says meline with the infinitive indicates imminence. So, and look, you and I have read countless articles by preterists or non-preterists, I say, and some former preterists who say, oh, well, mellow does not indicate imminence. You can go and pick up any lexicon. I've got an entire shelf of them right here. You've undoubtedly got a whole shelf of them here.
Yes. Now we're going to segue into the next text with this thought. His next passage was Romans 8, 18 to 23, speaking about mellow, and two other imminent time texts there.
Oh, yeah, but we got to do something else with Hebrews 11, because I'm telling you, yeah, this is absolutely incredible. Who are these great men and women of faith in Hebrews chapter 11? Now, remind me before we leave this, we want to talk about the land some more, okay? Because Hebrews chapter 11, 13 to 16, Abraham was promised physical land. Well, guess what? He got it, but that wasn't the land that he was looking for.
Exactly.
So we want to come back to that. Second point I want to get at, who are all of these great men and women of faith in Hebrews chapter 11? Well, we got Abel. Starts with Abel, strangely enough. And we go to Noah. We go to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And then we go to the list of those who were sawn asunder. They wandered about in deserts. And
I think I know where you're going.
I knew you would. They died for their faith.
Folks, were they martyrs?
I think they were martyrs.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we got Hebrews chapter 11, an entire chapter on the great men and women of faith, women who received their dead to life. Oh, but some refused that. They refused physical resurrection. What an incredible thought. Why? Oh, they were looking for the better resurrection. Oh, wait a minute. Aren't we told constantly physical resurrection is it? It's just the sine qua non. It's everything.
All right.
Oh, but Hebrews chapter 11 talked about those who would not accept deliverance from death because they look for a better resurrection. That's not the point. Point I want to make is you saw the train coming. Matthew chapter 23. Jesus, standing in the temple, spoke to the Jews and said, you are the sons of those who killed the prophets. You say, if we had been alive in the days of our fathers, we would not have slain the prophets. But in so saying, you testify that you are the sons of those who have killed the prophets. You adorn the sepulchres of the tombs of the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. For behold, I send unto you apostles, prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you shall scourge, chase from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood from who?
Righteous Abel.
Righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. That's a pretty comprehensive, inclusive group of martyrs. So Matthew chapter 23 is speaking of the vindication of the martyrs, those who died for God, for his word, for their faith.
And it's the judgment of the living and the dead.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
Okay.
Yeah. Here is the judgment of the living. All of these things will come upon this generation. There's the living. All of what things? The blood of all the righteous shed on the earth from righteous Abel. There's the judgment of the dead. We thus have the judgment of the living and the dead. And Jesus saying, verily, I say unto you, let's not forget the fact that that little Greek term, amen, lego humin, translated as verily I say unto you, is used something like 88 times in the New Testament. And it just simply calls attention to what is about to be said to emphasize what's just been said. So Jesus has been talking about the vindication of all the blood of all the righteous all the way back to Abel in a judgment that was going to come in that generation. And he says, verily I say unto you, this generation will not pass until all of these things are fulfilled. Hebrews chapter 11. All of the martyrs, all the way back to Abel.
So that's always my question to the partial preterists is, how were these martyrs vindicated that were under the altar? Revelation chapter 6, they were told it's going to be in a very little while that they would see that, and that the dead would be judged and rewarded. So again, Doug Wilson, how were the dead, how are these martyrs vindicated and rewarded? How were the dead rewarded in AD 70 without the resurrection?
Absolutely. I have called attention to this in my book on Daniel chapter 12. Pardon me. Jesus is witness to the fantastic faith of the centurion. Jesus was going to go to his house and heal his servant. And he said, not so, Lord. I am also a man under authority. I say to this man, go, and he goes, and a man that, et cetera, et cetera. He said, speak the word. My servant will be healed. And in that same hour, he was healed. But Jesus says, I've not found such a great faith in all of Israel. Verily I say unto you, many will come from the east and from the west, shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, let's see here.
Isaiah.
Pardon me. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are going to sit down in the kingdom, which is the resurrection. Unless you want to have them sitting at a banquet, the messianic resurrection banquet in Hades. Doesn't work. Okay. This is Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6. On this mountain, that's Mount Zion. Mount Zion is the eschatological mountain. It's the locus, pardon me. It's the locus of salvation, of kingdom, of the teaching of the law, of righteousness. Every eschatological tenet you can possibly imagine is focused in Zion. So on this mountain, the Lord said, I will make a great feast, a feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things. See, I love fat personally. So there I've got my justification for it. Give me a good T-bone with a big old chunk of fat in it, that big. So a feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things, and he will destroy death forever. Wait a minute. This is the messianic resurrection banquet. You don't get to sit at this banquet unless you're resurrected. Well, when would this take place? When would this banquet be fully established? Oh, you're going to see, and as the parallel in Luke chapter 13, 23 through 31 says, you're going to see this when you yourselves, that's the Jews, are cast out. So at the time of the casting out of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would sit down at the resurrection banquet. Now, wait a minute. I think Doug Wilson agrees that the Jews were cast out in
Yeah.
AD 70.
Yeah.
Yeah, he sure does.
I've done exhaustive study on this passage. And it's so funny, Don, because all of your cross references in your Bible are going to tell you that that event is the fulfillment of Isaiah 25.
Exactly.
And you read all the commentators, all of your good amillennial,
every one of them,
they're going to tell you this is the fulfillment. But when you read the partial preterists, they just tell you that Jesus's teaching here is fulfilled in AD 70, but they will not tell you where that promise is in the Old Testament, because
right?
they know if they do, that is when death is swallowed up and overcome. 1 Corinthians 15.
Exactly.
That's why they ignore it. That's why they won't talk about it.
That is exactly right. I'm just like you. I've done exhaustive research on Isaiah chapter 25. And believe it or not, I know you'll find this hard to believe, but I've actually started a book on just Matthew 8:11 and the correlation of Isaiah 25.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No one else wants to talk about it. I mean,
no one else wants to talk about it. So here we have the Messianic banquet. Here's the point I make in my Daniel chapter 12 book when I discuss Matthew chapter 8. Okay, if the Jews were cast out of the kingdom in AD 70, and that's the time of the banquet, then that's the time when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sit down in the resurrection banquet. But wait a minute. That means the resurrection took place in AD 70, but I think it's more than obvious. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't come out of the dirt to sit down at a literal physical banquet.
Exactly.
They were removed from Hades. They went to heaven.
So Doug fails, and the partial preterist fails when they connect the wedding, the eschatological wedding in AD 70, whether it's Revelation 17 to 21, or the divorcing of the harlot and the unfaithful wife, and the consummation and the marriage to the new covenant wife. They fail miserably to connect the Old Testament and the Jewish mindset, marriage, resurrection.
Absolutely.
They're nowhere to be found.
That's right. Well, Mike, that's 1 hour.
Wow, that went by fast.
I know it really did. So, folks, thanks for joining us. Pass the word, okay? I think you'll see that in direct contradistinction to Doug Wilson, who offered no exegesis, just a lot of objections. Mike and I are digging into the text. We're showing you what the texts say. We're showing the application of it, because that's the only thing that we're interested in, and that's God's truth. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you again next week.
Take care.
All right. That was a good show.
That was good. I enjoyed it very much.
I did. Now, talking about eating, I'm out of here, dude.
There you go. I also want to watch Tucker tonight. He's interviewing Musk.
Oh, really?
Elon Musk, yeah, on AI. So
interesting.
That should be real interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good night.
Take care.